Hello and welcome to part 2 of the PDA Society's Understanding PDA webinar series. Part 1 of the webinar focused on increasing our understanding of PDA as being part of the autism spectrum and an anxiety-driven need to be in control and avoid other people's demands and expectations. Today we'll move on to look at helpful strategies. For those watching this webinar live, you can submit questions at any time and we'll answer as many as possible after the presentation, which will last just over 20 minutes. You can ask questions by typing in the Ask a Question box on your screen. To start with, as with many things in life, we first need to look at ourselves and think about what personal mindset we can adopt that will give us the best chance of success. Ideally, everyone involved in living with, teaching or supporting the individual with PDA needs to adopt the same approach. It helps when we are flexible and imaginative, are genuinely positive in both our outlook and our body language, remain calm and level, see the individual's strengths and play to them, really work on building a relationship that is based on trust. Remember, we looked at the difficulty people on the autism spectrum have with trust in our first webinar, and earning this trust on a daily basis. And finally, focus on playing the long game, not on the quick win of gaining compliance or stemming less desirable behaviours in the moment, but on helping the individual with PDA to build personal understanding and self-esteem. Moving on to some specifics. Some of these strategies will work for you and some may not. It's about us sharing what has helped many people and you then experimenting to find out what works for you. The first point is to plan and think ahead, as the idea will be to try and manage anxieties, decrease uncertainty, and make accommodations in the home or school environment so that life is easier for the person with PDA. It's about trying to avoid the escalation in the first place rather than dealing with it when it happens. It's important to allow plenty of time for everything. Time pressures create their own demands in addition to the demand of the task itself. Individuals with PDA may also need time to process requests and organise their thoughts. Adopting a flexible and adaptable approach is also key. As anxiety increases, an individual's capacity to cope with demands decreases, so demands may need to be kept to a minimum, but they may be able to cope with much more when their tolerance for demands is higher. Pick your battles. Is the demand you're making really essential, or is it really essential right now? Could you ignore some of the less desirable behaviours for now? Also, individuals with PDA respond well to novelty and humour, so keep things varied. As we've said, capacity can vary from day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute. So reduce demands to the lowest level necessary. Sometimes it may be necessary to reduce demands to almost zero, perhaps only the most basic health and safety type demands, to enable a period of detox. And individuals with PDA need lots of downtime in order to recoup, recover, and allow the levels in their worry bucket to go down a bit. Where possible, try to avoid using emotionally loaded words such as can't, don't, or no. You can still convey the message without using these words. For instance, it's not possible right now, or if we do X, then Y will happen. Remaining as calm and neutral as possible, both in what you're saying and also in your body language when conveying these messages, is also helpful. Giving clear explanations about the reason something isn't possible will also be beneficial. And if it's situational or temporary, then add an explanation about when things will be able to return to normal. Having an exit strategy can enable somebody to tolerate the current situation more easily. If viable, offer positive alternatives whilst delivering the message that something isn't possible. Another strategy is to offer choices to allow the individual with PDA a feeling of control and autonomy. You could try offering 2 choices, where the one you want them to do is the easiest. As mentioned previously, sometimes leaving things too open-ended can be a demand in itself, so framing a question with 2 choices can be helpful. But do be willing to accept their own suggestion as a third alternative, provided the task is achieved or the question answered. This might be as simple as, would you like tea or coffee? And accepting the answer, hot chocolate. Your expectations may need to be somewhat disguised so that they aren't perceived so much as a demand. For instance, slipping demands in during general chit-chat or whilst engaging in a calming activity, can be effective and appear less direct. Referring to a demand in reference to yourself can also be helpful. For instance, "Oh no, I've forgotten to brush my teeth today. I'll go and do it now. Would you like me to bring your toothbrush down while I'm upstairs?" Modelling appropriate behaviour yourself without any expectation or suggestion that a child does the same can result in the child learning and copying your actions. For example, "I'm really stressed and anxious today, so I'm just going to have a lie down in my room so that I can relax and calm down." Or, "I'm sorry that I shouted at you. I didn't handle that situation very well at all because I'm so tired today." Talking with someone else in a child's earshot can also let them know what you'd like to happen without it being addressed to them directly. For instance, "It would be so lovely if we could all go out for lunch on Sunday." Or leaving leaflets or books around the house which might stir curiosity and allow them to initiate an activity or project. Likewise, use of praise and encouragement requires caution. It can be seen as creating another demand, and in the case of praise, a direct affirmation that they have complied with the demand can make it more difficult to do so again. So praise and encouragement needs to be very indirect. For instance, if your child has had a bath, your positive affirmation may be simply to say, "You smell nice today." Praising the results rather than the person can also work. For instance, "The colours in that drawing are beautiful," or "I wish I could produce such wonderful works of art," or "I have really enjoyed my time with you today." Encouragement needs to be extremely subtle so as not to compound the original demand. For instance, if you go to the cinema, you may really enjoy yourself and feel really good that you managed it. We can always come home if you feel anxious. Don't worry if you can't though, because we can try on another day. This is also an example of providing an exit strategy. Sometimes it's easier to comply if you know how and when you will be able to escape. Another approach to indirect praise is to tell a third person about an individual's achievements within their earshot, or maybe put it in writing by giving your child a little card or post-it note. There are lots more ways to make demands more indirect. Firstly, you can try to depersonalize the demands. For instance, by saying, "The manager is closing the swimming pool at 3 o'clock, or "The government makes the rules." Or use a third person, such as a favourite toy or a puppet, to communicate through. Distraction is another great technique. "I wonder if we could play with Lego whilst we get dressed or eat breakfast." As is humour. Try making a joke or putting on a funny voice. Likewise, it can work well to make things into a game. Who can get upstairs first or walk in the craziest way to the bus stop? Remember to curb your own competitive urges, though. Be imaginative and creative. Today's challenge, should you accept the mission, is to, and maybe link the request to a special interest. Or act dumb. "I wonder how socks get onto feet." Or talk aloud. "I wonder if anyone wants to choose which seat they sit in. I wonder if Tony knows how to put his clothes on. I'll just have to see." But remember, what works today might not work tomorrow. It's important to keep changing tack, always have plan B up your sleeve, and be flexible and adaptable. But if something has worked well, tuck it away for future use. However, we can't possibly get it right all the time, and meltdowns are still likely to happen. The first priority when we get to meltdown stage is safety. If you haven't already done so in advance, now's the time to move things that could be used as a weapon or anything that's very precious or valuable. It might also be a good idea to lock doors and windows. If a child is attacking someone else, put yourself in between them. Only use restraint as a last resort if a child is in danger. And if a child runs, follow at a safe distance. Having a previously agreed safe space to retreat to and recover in is also helpful. Preferably this would be somewhere the child has chosen. And remember to keep as calm as possible. However difficult it is for you, it's worse for the child who is experiencing a panic attack. Keep your tone and voice neutral and communicate calmly and quietly. In fact, at this time, it's best to say as little as possible, as your child will find it hard to process language. Just try some non-confrontational and reassuring phrases like, "It's okay, I'm here, I'll keep you safe." Try to preserve everyone's dignity and move on. So, does the traditional reward and consequences behaviour management method work at all? Generally, the answer is no. Star charts and rewards can create significant demands of their own, with lots of pressure to succeed, or may lead a child to feel that they have been tricked, or lead to disputes if a parent or teacher and the child have different ideas about whether or not a star was earned. Tangible and immediate rewards, surprise perks, or rewards that are linked to a person's special interests can all be very effective. For instance, I've got lots of work done today while you watch that film, and now I have more spare time than I thought I would. Would you like to do something nice with me, like bake a cake or paint a picture? It's really important not to withdraw a reward that has been earned if undesirable behaviour is repeated later in the day, as this may be seen as unfair, especially if that consequence was never made clear at the outset. Consequences or sanctions need to be treated with considerable caution. If it's a natural consequence, for instance, if a child breaks something and is therefore then not able to play with it again, that's fair enough. But as a general rule, it's far preferable to teach the benefits of cooperation rather than the confrontation that comes from consequences. And don't forget the old adage for all PDA-friendly strategies: what works today might not work tomorrow. So keep things varied and new, and don't expect anything to last for too long. Of course, it's up to you what your parenting or teaching style will be. You can take a more traditional approach and impose your will, have fixed boundaries, focus on the use of rewards and consequences, and on managing behaviour in the short term. Or you can adopt a more flexible, collaborative approach and focus on developing skills and trust. On the whole, the right-hand column is more effective when you're living in a PDA household. Many parents tell us that they have had to completely change their idea of parenting in order to successfully accommodate their child. This can be really challenging, especially if partners, siblings, or other family members aren't on board with you, and if outside agencies are critical of your parenting style. But hopefully this webinar, and the knowledge that many other parents also adopt the approach we've been outlining, will help to give you the confidence to parent or teach in the way that works for your child. This concept is backed up by Dr. Ross Green, whose approach many parents living with PDA find helpful. Dr. Ross Green is a visiting professor at Harvard University and has spent his life working with children. He started his career as a behavioral psychologist working in a young offenders institution, and eventually came to the conclusion that the classic route of managing difficult behavior through a combination of reward and punishment didn't work for a significant group of young people. He calls this group challenging children. Challenging in respect of the behavior exhibited, but also in that the child may challenge our preconceived ideas of what being a good parent or a good teacher is, and consequently challenge us to find different ways of bringing them up or teaching them. Dr. Green has developed an approach which is freely available but copyrighted under the phrase collaborative problem solving. He's written 2 books called The Explosive Child and Lost at School, and provides huge amounts of material on his website, Lives in the Balance. We'll give you a very quick guide to this now. There are 3 steps in Dr. Green's approach, which we'll go through one at a time. Change your lenses, identify lagging skills and unsolved problems, and solve problems collaboratively. Dr. Green's starting point is that we need to change our lenses, or our fundamental beliefs, as these determine the approach we take with our children. His first and most important principle is that kids do well if they can, rather than perhaps the more conventional assumption that kids do well if they want to. In other words, it's a question of ability, which ties back to Elizabeth Newson's explanation that with PDA the problem is an incapacity rather than naughtiness. The next point is that doing well is always preferable to not doing well. Realistically, none of us ever wants to do badly, provided that you have the skills to cope. Back to the question of ability. Point 3, that your explanation or your belief about child behaviour will guide your intervention, means that if you believe that a child is making a choice in their behaviour, then you will be more likely to take the traditional route of reward and punishment. Whereas if you believe that a child is lacking in skills, you will be more likely to try and help them to develop their skills and tackle the difficulties that arise from their incapacities. This is helpfully illustrated by the iceberg. Our behaviour, or our parenting or teaching style, the tip of the iceberg, is underpinned by our beliefs, thoughts and values. And lastly, be responsible to the hand you've been dealt. In other words, don't try to change what can't be changed, but rather adapt to your circumstances and try different approaches. We can't change the fact that a child has PDA, but we can change our parenting or teaching style. Step 2 of Dr. Green's approach is to identify lagging skills. There are 5 big ones. Number 1 is executive skills. These are the cognitive skills that help us to prioritize, make decisions, plan, and so on. If these are lacking, then everyday things can become overwhelming. Next up is language processing and communication skills, another biggie. This is all about how we understand what's being said to us and formulate our response. Some children take longer to do this than others. Some can misinterpret what's being said to them, or not be able to understand sarcasm or irony. The third is how we manage to regulate our emotions. We might take this for granted, but just imagine if you didn't have the filters or skill set to help you calm down when you start to get bothered. The fourth is all to do with how we can respond flexibly when a plan or situation doesn't go as we thought it would. It's about being able to adapt our thinking to cope with the new situation. And finally, social skills, understanding the rules of how people interact with each other. These aren't written down, so people lacking these skills might be seen as rude or insensitive, but it's often a direct result of a lagging skill. Other people may only see the top of the iceberg when it comes to a child's behaviour, but you have to look below as well to see what may be going on underneath. Now that we're looking at the child with the right pair of glasses, we can see that they may have lots of things to cope with, so it's highly likely that they'll experience many times when the demands of a situation exceed their ability to respond adaptively, and so this will provoke challenging behaviour, or, in Dr. Green's terminology, unsolved problems. Dr. Green has a tool on his website called ALSUP, an assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems, to help with identifying and prioritising. You may want to focus on the ones that are most severe or causing the most difficulties, or those that arise most frequently. It's important to tackle them one at a time and ensure that they are specific. Some examples might be difficulty getting out of bed in the morning in time to get to school on time, or difficulty getting started on the geography assignment about tectonic plates. Always think about what lagging skills may lay behind these difficulties. The next step is to think about how to solve the problem. There are 3 fundamental ways to tackle any problem. Traditional parenting or teaching tends to use Plan A. It's unilateral, involves imposition of an adult's will, often accompanied by adult-imposed consequences, and doesn't take account of the difficulties that a child may have, but means that they are unable to meet an expectation. Plan C isn't just about burying your head in the sand. It can come into play proactively. You decide it's the best option for now, or in an emergency situation, it's the only option for now. As we've already discussed, reducing demands can have a big positive impact, so don't be afraid to use this strategy. The for now part is a reminder to come back to it when circumstances or a child's ability to tolerate demand allow. Plan B is the route that Dr. Green's work is based on. It is explained in detail in his 2 books and on his website. In very brief terms, it is about finding a win-win solution which solves problems for the long term by working collaboratively and indirectly addressing lagging skills along the way. Plan B involves 3 steps. Empathy, where you seek information to really understand what's going on from the child's perspective. Defining your concerns, where you put your points on the table. And finally, inviting the child to find solutions which are realistic and mutually acceptable. As so much of our children's time is spent in school, it's really important to know that there are some Department of Education supported good practice guidelines covering the distinctive clinical and educational needs of children with PDA. These guidelines lay out good practice to help educators understand the distinct profile of children with PDA as learners. The guidelines also explain how a school can plan for success across several areas, what cultural standards need to be developed across the organisation, what physical accommodations in the school environment will help, and what personal mindset educators can adopt, along with a host of practical classroom tips. If you're a parent, it's worth reading these yourself and making sure your school has a copy as well. You can download these from our website or from the Autism Educational Trust website. There's also a positive PDA booklet downloadable on our website, with strategies developed following research from educational psychologist Dr. Emma Gore-Langton and written by Zoe Sison, a parent and teacher. We hope that this webinar has increased your understanding of PDA and introduced you to some of the most helpful strategies when living or working with somebody with PDA. We'll now look at where you can go for further information. The PDA Society aims to raise awareness, increase acceptance, and enable people to take action about PDA. There is a wealth of additional information on our website, including details of how to seek a diagnosis, helpful strategies, case studies, videos, links to lots of other resources, including the latest research, a discussion forum, and a parent inquiry line. The National Autistic Society also has a very useful section on PDA on their website. And Dr. Ross Green's website, Lives in the Balance, is also an invaluable resource. There are 3 key books that we've drawn on a lot in this webinar. Understanding Pathological Demand Avoidance Syndrome in Children is the go-to book about PDA written by Phil Christie et al. There's the 2 Dr. Ross Green books mentioned earlier, The Explosive Child and Lost at School. There is also a great book written by a PDA parent called My Daughter is Not Naughty, a book which helps explain PDA to children, and a book for siblings. All these are listed on our website. Details of training courses for parents and professionals provided by the PDA Society and other trusted organisations are also available on our website. There are many useful blogs about PDA. These include blogs with advice on many topics, blogs written by parents, and blogs written by adults with PDA. We list all those we know of on our website. Other social media, such as Facebook and Twitter, are invaluable sources of news and information. There are many Facebook groups about PDA. These are arranged geographically or by area of interest. For instance, there's one specifically for homeschooling and another specifically for adults with PDA. All those we're aware of are listed on our website. As well as the Facebook support groups, there are many parent groups which meet up regularly. Again, those we're aware of are listed on our website. Lots of parents say that it's only other parents who are in the same boat who can best understand and support one another. By the way, the PDA Society is run by trustees and volunteers who are all parents of children and young adults with PDA. Last but not least, we run an inquiry line where we can respond to inquiries sent to info@pdasociety.org.uk over the phone or via email in the strictest confidence. Many parents have found this service invaluable. Links to all the resources mentioned are in the Resources tab to the right of your screen. That concludes part 2 of our webinar. Thank you for listening. We'd like to thank Phil Christie, the PDA Development Group, the National Autistic Society, researchers Liz and Irons from Newcastle University, Dr. Ross Green, as well as others referenced during the presentation. We're now going to move on to our question and answer session. Because a technical glitch meant we weren't able to answer all the questions raised after our first webinar at the time, we've produced a short Q&A document to pick up on the outstanding queries, and this is available in the Resources tab. Once again, we have 2 of our trustees joining us today, Paula and Jane. So that's the end of the presentation. We're now going to move on to the question and answer session. I just want to check that Paula and Jane are live with us. Paula, Jane, are you there?
Hello, I'm here.
Hi, Paula.
Hi.
Are you there too, Jane?
Hi Becky, hi Paula.
Brilliant, that's lovely. So, like we did last time, I'm going to run through the questions and then pass over to you. So we've got lots of questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. We'll do questions and answers until about 1:45, and any that we don't get round to, we will do as we did before, a question and answer document afterwards. So the first question that we're going to tackle is, can psychotherapy be useful for people with PDA in terms of helping their self-esteem and their trust in themselves? Could we start with you on that, Jane?
Yes, certainly, Becky. I am finding through personal experience, as well as talking to other parents, that this can be helpful for children with PDA. Especially when we look at cognitive behavioural therapy, looking at emotions and how children feel about themselves and so on. the crucial aspect, I suppose, is the way that this therapy is delivered. Ideally, it would be delivered by a professional that has experience with PDA and that could approach the child with the use of PDA strategies to try and help them engage in the therapy in the first place. So this may be building up trust with the child, beginning by just sharing interests with the child, and then trying to develop strategies of how best to work with the child to incorporate these strategies. And that may be talking about things out loud, through a cuddly toy, indirectly through another person. Sometimes if the parent is there, the parent can speak with the professional. So the child's absorbing the information because it's being directed towards the parent, and the child may then engage during certain periods of the session. It can also be helpful if these sessions can be available either in the child's home or perhaps via Skype, because it can be very, very difficult to get children to go out to an appointment. And if they do go to the appointment, they may be very, very anxious and stressed by the time they get there because of the demands they've had to comply with in order to reach the appointment. So sometimes holding these sessions within the home can be far more relaxing for the child. I hope that helps to answer that question. I don't know if Paula has anything to add there, or you yourself, Vicky.
Vicky, I'll just chip in there. Obviously, psychotherapy is one type of therapy, but there are other therapies as well that could be beneficial for a child or an adult with PDA. But like Jane is saying, it would be most beneficial for the actual therapy to work if the therapist had some understanding of PDA. But other therapies could be drama therapy, works very well with PDA children. As we all know, they love to dress up and role play. So drama therapy could be a good way of getting alongside a child and working with a child. And also, I very much advocate for psychological therapy from a psychologist who has an understanding in PDA.
Great, thanks for that, Paula. We've got two questions that relate to violent behaviour. I'm going to tackle those together. With extremely violent behaviour, is it a good idea to involve the police, even if a child is extremely remorseful and may even self-harm afterwards? And linked to that, should there be consequences for violent behaviour, bearing in mind that the child isn't in full control of their behaviour and it's a form of panic attack? Can I start with you, Paula, on that one?
Sure, that's fine. Okay, I think maybe we need to start with saying that, if this is a child with PDA, then at this point in time when the child goes into a meltdown, which can be looked at like a panic attack because their anxiety is so high, they at that point have lost, most of their reasoning skills, and they have lost their social skills and their emotional regulation. So we are looking at a child that obviously has big difficulties in the areas that you quoted earlier, Vicky. So at that point, the child isn't aware exactly of what they're doing if it is a meltdown. And the child can react in various ways. We do know that the standard biological reaction to anxiety is the fight, flight, or freeze behaviours. So obviously this particular child who's acting very aggressively, maybe violently, has obviously gone into meltdown and is unaware probably of what they are actually doing. So at that point, would we call the police? My answer to that, in all my vast years of experience, would be that calling the police would heighten the child's anxieties, heighten the family's anxieties, and what would the police be able to do? Well, in my experience, and that of many other parents I've spoken to, is that the police either can come in and try to calm the situation, which is very difficult, or they can take the child away for a particular time. I believe that possibly isn't the right thing to do unless somebody is very, very much in danger. The child, or maybe another adult or member of the public, or another child. If the parents really can't keep the family safe, it might be the answer. But I think in most cases it is the parents being able to let the child go through the meltdown, be able to then calm themselves, give them a space to be able to come down and calm. And I think that's probably the best scenario. Now, we were also talking about, should we then give the child punishments, consequences? I think that's what you were saying, Vicky.
Yep.
Well, let's look at this again. Let's say this child is a PDA child who has a disability, a lot of difficulties, and incapacity. So should we be giving consequences and punishments to a child that couldn't help what happened because their worry bucket had actually, overflowed? So my answer to that would be no, but maybe we do at some point need to talk about what happened and get the child to be, understanding that there might have been a different way. Or maybe the parents needed to deal with things in a different way before it reached meltdown. Jane, do you have anything to add on that?
Completely agree with everything that you've said there, Paul, and I think you've covered that really, really well. Just to reiterate, really, it's a question of trying to look at all the strategies that are being used to try and prevent getting to the stage of meltdown in the first place, which isn't always possible. But having all of those in place can reduce down the amount of meltdowns and possibly the severity of the meltdowns.
Mm-hmm.
If we do find ourselves in meltdown territory, I try to think of it as looking at how we get through the storm together. So it's using those strategies of how to handle a meltdown without judgment, blame, or repercussions, so that we're helping the child move through it in a calm way. And as Paula says, to perhaps discuss at a later date some ways that might be more productive ways of channeling that anxiety, if the child can catch the anxiety before they reach the point of meltdown. And there is a very good book available that can be helpful for this. I think it's called The Amazing 5-Point Scale, which helps children to look at understanding themselves when those emotions are perhaps racing out of control, so that they can develop their own self-help strategies of what they can do in certain situations to remove themselves from that situation before they get to the point of meltdown. And very often after a meltdown, a child will feel a huge amount of guilt, even though they may not show it. But I think the lady or the gentleman that posted the question mentioned about self-harm and so on. And self-harm is a sign very often of really not thinking a lot about yourself, of thinking that you're worthless, of being angry with yourself. So the child's already experiencing natural consequences to that meltdown. So it's very much a question of helping the child to learn different ways of dealing with things, and to help them through the meltdown, and to help them following the meltdown and not feeling bad about themselves, but in learning new ways that they can cope.
That's great.
Great, thank you for that, Jane. Another question here is focusing on siblings and asking whether there are any strategies we would recommend for supporting siblings to cope with a sibling who may have PDA. Jane, can we start with you on that? Because I know that's something that you've been focusing on recently.
Yes, I think coping with siblings in families is very, very difficult for many families, even if the family doesn't have any children with any special needs. It can be difficult to meet the needs of individual children within that scenario. We are hoping to have a new article on the PDA Society website shortly that will focus on the area of siblings. And I think one of the important things to do is to try and educate siblings about PDA, how it affects their sibling with PDA, and why it makes them behave in the way that they do. And this can be a starting point for siblings to develop further understanding of their sibling with PDA and to look at things that they can do to try and reduce the impact on them. So it's about them also adopting PDA strategies so that they can learn to play and interact with the sibling, and hopefully without provoking those outburst responses, meltdowns and so on. And it's helping the child to understand that the parents are also there for them, that they can go and talk to the parents with anything that they're upset over or anything that they're struggling to cope with, so that the parents can help them, through that process and problem solve together with different ways of dealing with the sibling and so on. And I think it can also be helpful if parents can sometimes adopt a consistent approach to parenting, and this can reduce the feeling of unfairness that siblings can feel if there's one set of rules for one child and a different set of rules and a different parenting style for another child. And the way I look at it, certainly with my children, was we would have different expectations for our children depending on the needs of each individual child and what they were capable of and what their skill sets were. And when these went wrong or we had difficulties, rather than using traditional parenting, we would try and problem solve. So even if the child doesn't have a special need or doesn't have PDA, sometimes problem solving and looking at that collaborative approach can be very, very beneficial for all children, and it can help to reduce the unfairness of feeling that one child is managed in a certain way and a sibling is managed in another way. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Paula.
I think I'd add just 3 quick things.
Yeah.
I'd say sometimes it's really beneficial to the sibling if one of the parents can take them out for a special time, maybe once a week, once a month, however often you can build it in, so that that sibling has individual time, consistent time with a parent. It can be a fun time, it can be a talking time, a doing time, just some, very individual time with the parent. The other thing is about keeping the sibling safe. So many parents, advocate for their sibling of the child with PDA to actually have a very safe space that they can sort of run to if the PDA child goes into a meltdown and becomes quite aggressive. So there could be a safe place for that child to go and keep themselves safe. The other thing I would say is sometimes it benefits the sibling to have a special friend. It might be an auntie or an older sister that can sit with them and talk to them. Maybe take them out just to a little cafe or something, or a park, and talk to them about family life. Siblings don't always want to open up to their parents because they can see that their parents are very stressed with the behaviour of the PDA child. So sometimes it's best that the sibling has an individual that's maybe not in the immediate family but in the extended family.
Okay, if I can just add to that as well, Vicky, because I've just thought of something. There is a really, really good question and answer sheet that's been written by parents of a child with PDA to try and help siblings, to understand their sibling with PDA and different ways of trying to do that. And I think that is on a blog called PDA Parenting. So if you Google PDA Parenting, siblings, it should take you to that document which you can download, and that's a really useful resource for parents to use for their siblings. Not for their siblings, sorry, for their other children who have a sibling with PDA.
Great. I'll try and add that to the resources tab as well, so that that's useful for people to be able to access. Thanks, Jane. Okay, next question. I'm not doing these in actually order that they've always been asked, but in order that the questions are most commonly asked on our helpline, because I know that these things come up quite regularly. So the next one is going to be in relation to social services having a different view about what might be underlying the behaviour. So the question is, how do I deal with social services who say the behaviour of our teen is due to lack of boundaries and consequences, and that his violence, in inverted commas, is just a learned behaviour. So social services having a different view of parenting and what may be going wrong. So
can I start with that one, Vicky?
Yes, start with you, Paula. I was going to say, please.
Okay. This is quite a common difficulty that parents find themselves in. Sometimes it's because parents have actually approached social services for help with their child. And then what happens is social services see the behaviour of the child and unfortunately blame the parenting skills of the child, of the parents. So it is unfortunate this happens. There are two departments within social services I want to say at the outset. So social services for things like safeguarding, child protection, etc. And then there's the children's disability team within social services. It is quite rare, I suppose, that children with PDA who are high functioning actually get a service from the children's disability team, as it's usually for children who have learning disabilities. So unfortunately, families that approach social services with a PDA child who's high functioning will often be presented with the social workers who work on looking after the well-being of children and sometimes falling into the child protection category. So how do we prevent social workers from seeing our children's behaviour as anything more than bad behaviour? I think really that's the question we're asking. And I think a lot of that could be overcome if the child had a diagnosis and the parents gave some vital pieces of information to social services. I'd certainly recommend our reference booklet for clinicians and practitioners as a piece of literature that parents should be giving to social workers. They can be obtained by downloading them from our website, or you can actually request the nice glossy hard copy from us and we can post them out to you. So it is difficult for social workers to see anything but the behaviour unless there's a diagnosis underpinning that behaviour. And it is quite vital, I think, if parents are involved with social services, for them to seek a diagnosis, an assessment and diagnosis for their child, especially if the child is being, quite aggressive and violent, and the child is already a teenager. As we know, PDA is a lifelong condition. They can learn to cope with some of their behaviours and modify their behaviours, but it is a lifelong condition. So maybe it is a situation where this particular family do need to be seeking a diagnosis or better informing social services.
Yeah, I mean, that's brilliant advice, Paula. And if I can just add as well, sometimes the manner in which we approach professionals can make a huge difference. So if we can take some information along and say, we understand totally why you may be viewing this as a behavioural problem or as a result of not having firm boundaries in place or parenting. However, there is a lot of information available that does offer these other explanations in line with the underpinning condition of PDA, and that you'd be really grateful if the professionals concerned could read this information and have an open mind and try and work in a collaborative manner with the parents to try some of these alternative approaches, because there's nothing to lose and everything to gain. And there are also lots of courses now available for professionals that are run by other professionals that are aimed at teachers, social workers and clinicians and so on, and whether the professional involved would be willing to try and attend a course to develop further understanding and to work with the parents, because the main person that will benefit will be the child and the family, because that greater understanding will lead to better long-term outcomes. So it's about really trying to encourage sometimes professionals to be open-minded and to work with you and, to just request rather than insist that they read the information that you can provide for them.
I think I would also reiterate that social workers are qualified professionals, but unfortunately they don't always have understanding or any qualifications or any training in ASD or PDA. So they will, presented with a child who has some usually quite aggressive or shocking behaviours, they will see the behaviours as lack of parenting skills. So we do need to inform social services, social workers, of what it means to have a diagnosis of ASD or PDA.
Thank you both. I've got a question here that links very much to this discussion. This person is asking, there is no recognition of PDA by child psychiatrists in the area I live, and I have a violent teenage son who has been involved with police on several occasions. Social services regard us as poor parents, and at the last children's panel, this is in Scotland, were suggesting placing our son in a generalist children's home and not a specialist autistic school or home. Do we have any advice? They feel that the key to getting the issue is getting his PDA recognised, but perhaps with a focus here in terms of being placed in a generalist children's home. Excuse me, I'm just going to cough.
Okay, maybe I should start with that one while Vicky's coughing then. Obviously, we are parents in an English system. We don't quite understand the Scottish system as such. Maybe this child does or doesn't have any type of diagnosis. We're not sure. Also, we're not quite sure what the panels are. I would say it would be most beneficial to get an assessment, not necessarily an assessment for diagnosis, as I know that's particularly difficult in Scotland, but an assessment on maybe from an educational psychologist, so that the educational psychologist could come from two angles: the difficulties the child has had and why in education, and the actual emotional well-being of the child from the psychologist's point of view, so that we can see the child's difficulties, core root difficulties in social communication, interaction, regarding very little emotional regulation, etc., etc. Then maybe the panel would be better informed. The other thing I would say is, sometimes just getting an assessment or paying for an assessment at this stage could stop this spiral of this child's, I don't know what to call it really. I think putting a child that possibly has PDA into a children's home would be quite detrimental to the child's well-being and mental health. This child needs specialist services, needs specialist education, and I think this is the time to make the Scottish panel professionals sit up and take notice. And I think that can only be done by getting a very specialist assessment of the child's skills and well-being.
Thank you, Paula. Jane, did you want to have anything to add before we move on to the next question?
I don't think I can add anything to that. I think Paula's described everything perfectly there, and it really is a case of, like Paula said, trying to get an expert involved that has got experience in this area that can offer, some really good advice and support in the best way to move forward. And that may be one of the diagnostic services that currently assess and diagnose PDA. And perhaps the social services could commission one of those organisations. The only other option that I can think of, and I don't know if it's the same in Scotland, is if it's possible to apply to the local clinical commissioning group, the local health authority, for an out-of-area referral, for funding via health, for an out-of-area referral for an assessment, or for social services to commission that expert themselves.
Great, thanks very much for that, Jane. We've got two questions here that are linked again. They're to do with diagnosis of PDA, and both come from parents who are in Hertfordshire, where apparently the PDA is not currently recognised. So I'll read them both out. Who would I approach to get an out-of-area referral for an assessment for my child who I wholeheartedly believe has PDA? She is currently referred to CAMS, speech and language, and various other organisations, but I have been told already that my area, which is Hertfordshire, don't recognise PDA as a diagnosis, which will ultimately possibly deny my child the help she needs. So that's in relation to out-of-area referrals. And another person from Hertfordshire. I live in Hertfordshire. I'm currently awaiting diagnosis assessment for an ASD for my 14-year-old son. I understand from CAMS, who we're engaged with, that PDA isn't recognised here. How can we best deal with that when we go for assessment in May? So could I start with you, Paula, on that one?
Yes, certainly. Okay, so the first question from the first parent was regarding how to approach getting a diagnosis for PDA. They're already in some services, and it looks like their particular county don't recognise PDA. So what we would have to do then is to say, well, if that particular local authority do not recognise PDA, and you're already within quite a few professional services for assessments, you may have to go back to your GP. You go back to the GP and you say that the professionals within the county have actually said that they don't recognise the disorder to which your child, you feel your child actually has, which is PDA, and that you particularly know that your child has this disorder. You will need to present to the GP some pieces of literature on PDA, and possibly a short letter asking the GP to make a referral to the clinical commissioning group. So that's what the GP would do, and the GP would do a funding referral to the CCG, and it would be up to the CCG then whether they said yes or no to a specialist out-of-county referral, and whether they would fund it or not. We have an excellent website which is called PDA Guidance. We'll put that link on at the end of the session today. PDA Guidance. You'll be able to get it if you just type that into Google, and it takes you through all the steps of looking at an out-of-area request for an assessment and diagnosis. But GP and clinical commissioning group is where it starts. The second question was around, they were awaiting an ASD assessment, but already know that their local authority won't be diagnosing PDA. We want to say to everyone, whether you're in that county or anywhere else in the UK, that what the professionals within the PDA development group and the NAS are now saying is that a diagnosis of ASD, autistic spectrum disorder, with a profile of PDA is an acceptable diagnosis of PDA, because it is stating that they have the profile of PDA and that the child will require all the strategies and handling management guides for PDA within school and within the home. So it's quite acceptable for any local authority to diagnose ASD with the demand avoidant profile or PDA profile or PDA traits, and that's quite acceptable. I'm not sure if I can tackle any more of the second question. You'd need to remind me again, Vicky.
Okay, or anything you can add, Jane, whilst I'm just trying to find that second question again.
Yes, it's about, if you've got an ASD assessment coming up, it's, as Paula said, it's about perhaps, working with that diagnostic team to try and have an assessment that's going to be ASD, perhaps with a profile of PDA or with demand avoidance. It can be helpful for parents to have a look at all of the features that their child exhibits that does fall in line with what clinicians may be looking for in ASD. And also to provide the clinicians with information of the atypical profile of PDA, that they can have the better, appear to have the better social understanding, social skills, eye contact, imaginative play and so on, so that you're highlighting that you're aware of where the differences are, what the atypical profile is, but also providing a good list of features that a clinician may be looking for an assessment of ASD. And there's information on the National Autistic Society page about the sorts of features that children with Asperger's, autism exhibit, and a lot of these can also be found in children with PDA. It's just scratching beneath the surface and also tying that in with the atypical aspects of the presentation as well.
I'm afraid that, it's 2017, but parents are still having to do an awful lot of work and learn a lot themselves and understand a lot about PDA before they actually approach these clinical professionals for diagnosis. They need to be writing down exactly the difficulties that their child has, and that can only be done and pinpoint to ASD or PDA if the parent thoroughly understands their child's difficulties. So I'm afraid still the onus is on the parent doing their homework before going to an assessment.
Thanks, Paula. Reading the question again, I think you've both covered the points raised brilliantly there. Thank you. Whilst we're on the subject of assessment, we've got a question here relating to a child, a daughter, hiding her difficulties well from other people, and also when she was at school, although she's now home educated. And the parent is concerned that if they pay for an assessment, they worry that the assessors won't see her problems and therefore they won't get anywhere. So what advice do we have for a situation where a child masks in other environments but demonstrates the PDA behaviours at home, and the concern from the parent that if they pay for an assessment, the behaviours won't be seen and therefore they won't make any progress?
Okay. I think the first thing to say is that when parents go to independent private specialist diagnostic centres, they will be getting professionals who are thoroughly trained in PDA. They've specialised in this particular disorder, as well as all other ASDs. So when they present their child for the assessment, those particular professionals will be looking very hard and very deep at all the child's presenting behaviours, and they will probably, what I know that they do is they start off by befriending the child and playing with the child within their centre, and then they step up the demands and requests upon the child and see what the child's reactions are. Now, obviously, the child that's masking will try to do the tasks involved, but at some point they will show their particular difficulties either with only surface sociability, difficulties with anxiety, and those professionals will pick up on the smallest details. So I hope that goes some way into helping the parent to realise that these professionals who we are trusting and paying privately to get assessments with our children, they really are quite specialists.
Thank you for that, Paula. Anything to add, Jane?
Okay, I was a little bit distracted during that answer. There was some things going on here. So I apologise if I'm repeating what Paula said. But yes, certainly from my personal experience of having my daughter assessed, she didn't need to show challenging, disruptive behaviours. We were sat in a room with the clinicians with the two-way mirror while they were assessing her, and they picked up on the slightest, most subtle demand avoidance that was shown. So it didn't need to be obvious. And it's not just the demand avoidance, of course, that they're looking for, it's those other aspects of ASD with the difficulties with social communication, understanding and so on. And they do pick up on the most subtle aspects even when the child was masking. That's been my personal experience, that you don't need to think that you need to go and that your child's going to be explosive and showing all these very dramatic symptoms. They can pick up on the very, very subtle.
Great, thanks for that. I don't think that overlapped unduly with what Paula said, so that's great. Well done, Jane. Thank you. So another question now relating to whether PDA can exist in its own right when a developmental disorder, i.e. autism, isn't present. So do we ever see the presentation of PDA separately from an autism disorder? It seems that anxiety underlies PDA, which makes this person wonder whether it might be sometimes present due to the anxiety alone and in the absence of a developmental disorder. Can we start with you again on that, Paula?
Yeah, certainly. I think I really do need to go back to the research that's, currently available. And all the research currently available points PDA to having a root of autistic spectrum disorder, i.e. Social interaction difficulties, social communication difficulties, and, the need for routines. So I think as it stands at the moment, there hasn't been any research on whether, PDA can actually present on its own. We are all saying that it has the root core difficulties within ASD and then a lot of other difficulties on top as well, such as the, demand avoidance, the controlling, the obsessive nature, etc., and anxiety. The thing about PDA at the moment is that it is still evolving. Although, Elizabeth Newson did the initial research and identification of PDA back in the 1980s, and there has been further research, especially in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, we are still seeing, as further research comes forward, that even the diagnostic criteria is being slightly refined. But at present, there hasn't been any research to suggest that PDA can be totally a standalone diagnosis.
Yeah, if I can just add to that as well, Vicky, I think anxiety is the driving force behind the demand avoidance, but what is the driving force behind the anxiety? And very often the driving force behind the anxiety is the difficulties associated with ASD in intuitively understanding social communication, interaction, and so on. And very often, certainly as the child grows older and we have the PDA strategies in place and that very explosive behaviour subsides, the autistic-like traits can become much more obvious. So for somebody that's looking at a child, they may be seeing that outward presentation of PDA, and they may not be seeing the autistic-like traits that are underpinning that presentation because the behaviour can camouflage it. And also the atypical presentation means that some of these children can fall through the ASD diagnostic net because they can appear to have better social skills, but it's only when we're carefully looking that these social skills can seem to be at the surface level only. They can be copied, role-played, mimicked from other people, so lack true depth and understanding. And so sometimes it's really scraping beneath the surface of the presentation that we need to do in order to see the underlying autism that is producing that anxiety that is then driving that profile of behaviours.
Great, thanks for adding to that, Jane. Moving on now to a couple of questions that relate to education. We have a question here. I support a 14-year-old boy in mainstream secondary school who hates maths. Who can blame him? And despite having access to a one-to-one help in the classroom, does everything he can to be sent out of the lesson by causing maximum disruption. We have tried countless strategies to help change his mindset towards maths, and I'm aware he has a fear of failure. What else can we try?
Ooh, right, okay. Well, they've certainly tried quite a few things, and it's wonderful to hear that, he does have the one-to-one. I'm wondering whether we could possibly try not even coming into the maths classroom. And then, in time, might be months, might be longer, reintroducing them into the classroom in time. But I would have thought that the teacher of maths could give the teaching assistant the worksheets to do with the child, maybe in another room. Let's eliminate this need to get out of the classroom and this disruptive behaviour. Let's take that away. Then let's look at the way maybe we are teaching maths. Are we going to make it, take it back to basics maybe? Give him some really easy worksheets to do. Let him achieve something if he's got a fear of failure. And then slightly increase over the weeks the level of the maths that he's doing. Could we use a computer, a laptop? Give it another interest for him, because he needs to be enthused about maths. So I would suggest maybe out of the classroom, laptop, easier work to start off with and then increasing it over time, and then eventually getting him back into the classroom if that's appropriate. So I think they're the things that I would look at doing first and foremost.
Yeah, and it might be helpful. Definitely agree with what Paula says about the one-to-one and trying to take it out of the classroom. But it may also be helpful if the child's given a choice of different worksheets and they can choose which one that they do, because then that will give them the feeling of control and more feeling of certainty, that they've got that choice. They can see what the different options are and they can then choose one. And in some cases it even goes, can be a case of really pulling things back so that the lesson is really adapted and geared around an interest. So whether it's Pokemon, Minecraft, or some other interest that we think, how can we use that interest to incorporate maths while we are engaging in an interest? And then that really disguises the demand, makes it more fun, and can keep it within the child's control and within their interests. There is very useful educational guidelines available, but there's one that the teacher may not have read, and that's from the National Autistic Society by Jelly Davies. And there's some really useful strategies on there of helping children to engage in lessons and different ways of delivering the curriculum.
Do you think we could put that link on at the end, Vicky?
Yeah, I will do. I think that's a relatively new one, isn't it? So I'll add that to the resources tab. And I know that we've also got a question here about the Q&A from the first webinar, which I think isn't in our resources tab for webinar 2, so I will add that in afterwards as well. So thank you for that. Another education-related question now about more to do with homeschooling. This person's son is currently unable to make it to school because of his anxiety and hasn't been able to for 2 months now. We're considering options of alternate schools or even homeschooling, and this parent would like to hear of others' experience of a PDA child's responsiveness to homeschooling. Can we maybe start with you, Jane, on that one?
Yes, certainly. Homeschooling is an option that many parents take, and there's 2 options here. If the local authority are in agreement that homeschooling is better for the child, they may supply the homeschooling and remain responsible for the child's education. So that's one option, and in that case you're not taking your child off the school roll. Hopefully in an EHCP it would be stated that the child's receiving an education otherwise than at school. And so that's for those parents who don't want to take that full responsibility and want to remain with the child on roll as such, or with the local council still responsible and still working with them to provide some type of education. The other option is elective home education, where a parent takes the child off school roll, and in that case they become completely responsible for that education, financially and otherwise. Some parents may find that their children will do certain amounts of work if it's presented in an innovative, fun and novel fashion. Other parents may find that they need to go down the route which is more in line with unschooling, really, which relies on the philosophy that if you leave a child to follow their own interests, they will learn naturally through play. And that's an option that we took with our daughter. We removed her from the school register, we homeschooled her for a number of years, but there wasn't any direct learning. We just allowed her to learn through playing on Minecraft, drawing, colouring in, following her own interests. And that was very successful. She actually taught herself to read and write by trying to navigate the internet. She's a wonderful flair for arts and crafts and creative things like that. And also very often we find children will scour the internet, YouTube, to find science experiments that they can do, information on space and so on. So that can be a really good way for children to access home education, learn at their own speed and in their own time. It reduces anxieties, and a child may reach the point where they feel that they would like to engage in school again at a later point. And then we can start the process again of trying to help them back into school if that's something that seems suitable in the future.
Great, thanks, Jane. Anything to add to that, Paula?
No, I don't think so. I think Jane's really covered it.
Okay, brilliant. I'm conscious that we haven't got too much longer left, so I'll try and whiz through a couple of questions quickly as we can. My child has recently got a PDA diagnosis. The past help from social worker and family support worker has always been around their issues with my parenting, as we've discussed quite a lot earlier, as they believe I don't have enough boundaries and there are no consequences. I feel that my relationship with my child has massively deteriorated due to trying the numerous methods from the various parenting courses they asked me to do. What is the best way to now rebuild that relationship with my child? So,
I think that's really quite sad that, this parent has had to go on several parenting courses and been made to try, all these different parenting strategies, which are obviously standard, type parenting strategies. When actually, her daughter had a diagnosis of, now has a diagnosis of PDA, and obviously, the best parenting strategies are the PDA ones. How does she rebuild, her relationship with her daughter? Well, it's going to be slow and steady. She's got to be in it for what we call the long game. So it's about building trust. And trying to do all the negotiating, the choices, and giving it lots of time, spending as much time as she can with her child. So that's probably the best advice I could give. And actually maybe if the child's old enough, she could sit down with the child and explain, that it was this department that, asked her to try all these different parenting courses and parenting styles with, her daughter, and that actually they were wrong. And now that the child has a diagnosis of PDA, she knows the strategies she needs to use and the way she needs to parent her daughter, and literally explain this and say, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. It's better for us as parents to model good behaviour and therefore saying sorry to our children, because it teaches them how to behave. So I hope that's good advice.
Yeah, I think that's really, really good advice, Paula. And sometimes when relationships have broken down between a parent and a child can be very, very difficult to reach. They may become very reclusive, very avoidant at spending time with the parents, because they may feel that there is that break in trust. And a good way of rebuilding this is implementing all those PDA strategies, apologising and explaining, as Paul has said, and then very, very slowly trying to re-engage the child with very small incremental steps. Depending on the age of the child, it may just be leaving things around the house that the child may have a curiosity about, that may want to engage in, but that will require parent involvement. So you leave the things around the house, the child will get curious, then perhaps need a parent to help them. And this can open up the door to just having that small amount of quality time with each other, with the use of those different strategies to start rebuilding that trust. And that's going to take time, it's going to be a gradual process, but it is possible.
So Jane, would you say, when you said leaving things around the house, do you mean things like maybe a set of makeup or a set of nail polish or a craft activity?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't explain that properly. Yeah, it could be a little packet baking set. It could be an arts and crafts set. It could be a magazine, that could look at together, or anything that you know the child's interested in. If you're picking it based around their interests, or it could be a leaflet to, print off what's on the cinema, leave that lying around. Just something to try and promote that engagement, but for the child to come to the parent.
Yeah, brilliant.
So you have that associated demand, and for the child to then start moving away from those negative experiences, which isn't the parent's fault. I think we've all tried those strategies in the early days, but for the child to begin replacing those experiences with these new positive ones moving forward.
Great. We'll just try and squeeze in one last question if you've still got any breath left, ladies, because I think this is something that also perhaps comes up from time to time. So it's a question to do with diagnosis again, but whether or not a child might meet all the criteria. So this is from a mum to a girl who is 8. My daughter didn't appear to have developmental delays, but was advanced talking at 18 months. Could she still have ASD, as she exhibits a host of PDA traits, but these are being masked by behaviour, obsessions, eating problems, and skill at avoidance strategies? So do you have to sort of fulfil all the criteria on the list, including the developmental delay criteria, to sort of qualify, if you like, for a PDA diagnosis, an ASD diagnosis with a PDA profile? Can I start with you, Paula, on that one?
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I think whilst every child is different, every PDA child is also different. And therefore, they may all fulfill either everything in the criteria for a diagnosis of PDA. They may fulfill maybe, sort of 3/4. The things that the professionals, the specialists in PDA, say are probably the least important in the list of diagnostic criteria is actually the language delay and the neurological involvement. And I think there's another one, I can't quite think of it off my head right now. So they are the least, there's the least need for those to be present in the child to still have a PDA diagnosis condition. So when we look at the main things, which are the avoidance of demands, the controlling behaviour, the obsessive difficulties, especially maybe with people, they are probably the most prevalent in children who may have PDA. The others are probably the least prevalent, but they need to have some degree of most of the criteria. Whether it's to a severe degree or a mild degree, it doesn't matter, because we all know that the spectrum is wide and PDA is dimensional.
Yeah, that's correct. My daughter didn't have any delay with language, and she had the diagnosis of PDA. Some of the things to look out for in language, even with children that are very articulate, can be sometimes the content of language may appear bizarre. They may often talk, I think one of the phrases used is that sometimes the language used can be like that of somebody much older, like a little old lady almost, that they'll use terminology, phrases and language that they've heard copied around them, that they've heard spoken around them, and sometimes they may mimic this but without having the true understanding of the language that they're using. So even for children that are very articulate, it may be that the content of some language may appear bizarre, copied, mimicked from those around them, and also they may have difficulty with processing language. So some of the difficulties with language can still be there, but it may not be that the presence of verbal communication has been delayed.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Jane. So we're going to wrap up in a minute. I'm just going to end on this really positive message that somebody has posted. Thank you very much. I don't know where else to put this, so I just want to use this opportunity to thank you for all the time and work you do. Finding the PDA Society website was the first I knew of PDA, and it has got us on the right path to getting our son diagnosed, and it continues to help. This webinar, the Q&A sessions have been fantastic. Thank you so much. So thank you both very much to Paula and Jane for handling all those questions that I have fired at them. Just to wrap up, the link to the webinar and the Q&A recording will be available within 24 hours. If there are outstanding questions, I'll try and respond now, but if not, or if the response doesn't answer all your questions, or you feel that your questions weren't fully answered in the Q&A, please email our inquiry line on info@pdasociety.org.uk, where a small team of volunteers, parent volunteers who have all got children with PDA will do their very best to respond to you. So on that note, thank you very much. I know some people have had a few connection problems, but not nearly as many as last time, so I think we've managed better this time round. And the recording will be available for everybody within 24 hours. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Paul and Jane, and over and out.